Well, hi, welcome to AI for UX. This is the space where UX researchers and product leaders stay current with AI innovations. And I'm John Whalen. I'm the founder of Brilliant Experience, and we're a psychology driven product innovation firm. And in each installment, we speak to a founder of one of the latest AI enhanced tools and learn about its benefits and its inspiration. And with that, let's get started. I'm really excited to introduce Ben Hookway. So, Ben is the CEO of Relative Insight, a tool that transforms unstructured CSAT, NPS, and eNPS data into actionable insights. So, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. Delighted to have you here.
Great to be here, John, and great kudos to the accurate description of what we do as well. That was really good.
Sure. Well, I got to admit, I did have to study, but I got there. Well, and let's actually dive right into relative insight. So maybe you can just tell me, just to start, who is the target for your product, the target audience?
Yeah, so we are normally bought by people concerned with employee experience, customer experience, and marketing. So what we specialize in doing is telling our customers why their key metrics for customer experience are moving. So most customers will have something like NPS, Net Promoter Score, or CSAT for post-interaction score, or some kind of metric which measures customer health. So normally they know what that metric is, but they won't know why that metric is what it is. So they won't know why it's changing over time, or they won't know why it's different between different product lines or between different geographies. And the answer to the question why is normally in the open-end text associated with the metric. And that's what we analyze in order to let them know why their metrics are moving.
Right. And thank you. And certainly we do some, qualitative tests on different scales and so on. But I think you're thinking much larger than maybe sometimes we're more focused in specific product opportunities or other things like that. What's a typical type of customer or situation when this is used?
Yeah, so I think so. Normally, we're being used in consumer-facing organizations is normally the sort of scenario. So normally it is, for example, financial services, quite a lot of restaurants. We do very well with professional sports teams. We do well with healthcare and patient experience and things like that. So it's anywhere where our customer really needs to understand what their consumers are thinking about and what their opinion is, but at big scale. So it's certainly beyond the scale of something that you can just sort of manually read,
Mhm.
you know, reading your reviews once a week or something like that. So we deal with normally quite big data scales. And normally we're dealing also, though, we bring quite a lot of rigor, I'd say is the other key thing. So it's not just about volume, it's about rigor as well, because even if you did have the time to read lots and lots of reviews or surveys, the chances of you individually being accurate in your conclusions from that are quite remote, actually. Machines do a better job.
Yeah, this was really interesting when we first met. And maybe you can just tell me a little bit more. I have a question here about how does your product help with that? And I really think that's sort of two parts. One is literally how do you get to the why? And I think maybe without revealing, all your secrets, what generally how your technology works or your approach to this.
Yeah. So what we do fundamentally is actually compare language and tell you the difference. So the roots of this is actually in law enforcement. So
Hmm.
originally, Relative Insights' purpose in life was to uncover people masquerading online, normally in a child protection scenario. So we know if you're a 13-year-old girl or if you're a 40-year-old man doing a really good impression of a 13-year-old girl. We were originally designed to solve that problem. And it is actually a difficult problem to solve from a data point of view because bad guys are very good at being bad guys. So they will sound 97% perfect to the point where if you took suspect language and put it through a standard text analytics algorithm, the algorithm would probably tell you it is a 13-year-old girl. So obviously that's not a good result. So what we developed was a technique which is comparative linguistics. So what we would do is take databases of verified 13-year-old girl language from the security services. Then we take suspect language, we compare them, and our output is the 3% difference in the language. So the bad guys are like 97% perfect, but not 100% perfect. It's the 3% difference we would focus on. And that's what would lead to people being caught. And it's a whole nother podcast to talk about how we sort of move from doing that to kind
Yeah.
of what we do now commercially. But that principle of comparison, it underpins everything we do today in relative insight. So let's give some examples of how
Yeah.
that's used. Um, you could be, let's say you're in charge of a banking app and you do regular customer satisfaction scores on the app. When if you looked at the data on the survey coming back from people's opinion of the app, it's just going to talk about general app stuff, okay, which will not surprise you and isn't actually that useful. So it'll say things like UI and it'll say things like too small or too big or too many clicks or whatever it might be. That's not that useful. So let's say you've done a redesign of the app or some kind of tweak to the user experience. Well, what you really want to be doing is taking customer surveys before the redesign, taking them after the redesign, comparing them, and then seeing what's different. So when you do that comparison and you see
Hmm.
what's different, that's the actual result of your initiatives in the UX.
Hmm.
So what comparison does is that it takes you straight to what's actually important. And the other thing it does is that we manifest that comparison as a metric. So we just don't say, there's more mentions of smooth experience. We can actually say smooth experience is actually mentioned 2.1 times more now than it was. And being able to say 2.1 is really
Hmm.
important because I think historically, qual data
Yeah.
and text analytics has been quite a vague output. I think, people normally brace themselves when I'm saying I'm in text analytics. They think I'm going to like give them a word cloud or give them something like that. And that sort of vagueness hasn't done the discipline many favors. So being able to be really precise and say 2.1 times is a real advantage for stakeholders to understand what's important.
Yeah. Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was doing my PhD, I did have colleagues who were at like computational linguistics, and it was fascinating to see the sophistication of the algorithms, the way methodologies, some of the statistics behind it, and so on.
Yeah.
So actually, I'll get to this a little later, but I worked with the U.S. government here, and they've got some standard ways that actually, by law, they had to be measured to see how they were doing and to try to improve
Yeah.
themselves. And it's actually really interesting to hear how you're approaching this as well and the differences. So I actually did want to say, it's very clear how you're so different than many things out there. Maybe I can ask how I should think about working with a tool like yours. So if I didn't have relative insight and I was had I was one of the product lines at Pepsi or something, how might I work differently once I do have relative insight? How would I think differently? How would I approach problems differently?
So the comparative angle of what we do really opens up an awful lot of um, new angles to attack problems with. So normally the data which we're all analyzing comes with metadata attached. So in our world, let's say you've done a survey of consumer opinion of something coming out of Pepsi. Um, what that normally will sort of look like to us is that we've got the text, the response to the survey,
Mm-hmm.
but then we've got all these metadata points associated with that text. So it could be the age range, or it could be the geography, or it could be a whole host of different factors um, associated with the text. So what is normally really interesting is to compare these different metadata points against each other. So you might find that, let's say some sort of snacking product, something like that. Um, if you just look at the text on its own, it's just going to be snacking conversation, right? And it won't really be that surprising to you. But what's more interesting is to compare how does one age group compare with the other age groups. So what does that one age group talk about
Mm.
significantly more or less when it comes to the product or the service or the packaging or whatever. So they might talk about texture more. They might be more descriptive, right? It's not just a question of what they're talking about, but how they're talking about it. And this gives you a real clue into sort of understanding the different segments that you're designing for. So again, so it could be age, it could be different geographies of different preferences, and so on and so on. So rather than sort of looking at your language data as this kind of static data set, you can start to sort of create a sort of matrix of comparison out of it,
Hmm.
which makes it a lot more richer. And it just allows you to focus on what's really important for the different segments.
Do you ever, I don't think I had a chance to ask you this before. Do you ever try to organize by behavior or style so
Yeah.
it may be that there was a group of people who really like spicy food regardless of age, or some, I'm just trying to think of, or have a certain love to
Yeah,
skateboard
yeah,
regardless of age.
it's a
Yeah.
good question. I think the closest one to this we get to is, quite often brands will have segmentation databases. So they've already kind of done some kind of segmentation of, normally around age and geography and um, maybe income and things like this. And they sort of put these descriptors around the segments. Um, And quite often, what we'll do is take those segments and put open-end surveys out from those segments. And then when you get those responses back from those cohorts, you compare the cohorts.
Hmm.
And then you see whether there's actually any difference at all in your segments
Mm.
in what they think. Or if there are differences, they might be differences that you would never have thought of. Or in some cases, there are differences, but it's not necessarily down the segmentations that you've already put together. So what it does is that it lends a sort of new depth of rigor to like really understanding whether these sort of segments that you've put together are really representative and are targets that you should be thinking
Mm.
about, or maybe you should be thinking about slightly different slightly different cohorts.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for that. And many of the people watching this have been concerned with things like hallucinations by
Yeah,
technology or bias. And I know that a lot of what you're doing is a little bit more on the machine learning or statistical property side of the world.
yeah,
But maybe you
yeah.
can tell me a little bit about how you sort of address these kinds of challenges.
Yeah, so I think, man, where do I start? So I think so. First off, I think that the phrase AI. I think when it's being used in mainstream discourse, people really mean generative AI.
Mm.
When actually AI is actually really broad church
Right.
of different techniques. So um, I think we're just coming out of a phase in the industry where people are starting to understand what generative AI is absolutely fantastic for, but also what it was never designed to do. Um, and generative AI is, it's a non-deterministic model. So what that
Mm-hmm.
means is to just explain that for folk who don't know. If you kind of give it two inputs, you would expect exactly the same output from those two inputs. But that's not how generative AI works. So, in some respects, hallucinations are a feature of
Yeah.
generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a bug. That's just what they're designed to do. So the key with generative AI is to use it in the right place in your process. So where Relative Insight uses generative AI, everything I've just talked about so far is our own proprietary AI and doesn't use generative AI at all. So analyzing the language, producing the key metrics from the language, this is all like non-generative AI. But what's key about it is that, as I've said, we produce metrics. And metrics are key because it's evidence and it's confidence and it's an audit trail and so on. And so what we do is when our tool is used by our customers, they look at the output, they pull together their own reports using the metrics and the evidence that they get from Relative Insight, and then they distribute that to their stakeholders so that action can be taken. What we do now we've just introduced a generative AI report layer on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
So what it's doing is that it's taking the text that's being analyzed, but it's crucially, it's taking all the metrics that we're producing and it's infusing that into the report so that when you're getting a generative AI report, and there's lots of benefits for that, it's got consistent metrics and confidence. And unless you've got that, stakeholders are very circumspect about making any big decisions without it. So that's the key, is using generative AI to help and accelerate the storytelling process, but not relying on it to give you evidence and metrics, which is what we do.
Yeah, it's a fabulous balance. And certainly lots of folks in my, research, UX research, even agency research kind of land. One of our clients is one of the big technology groups. And they're like, oh, you've only interviewed 100 people, 200. We deal in millions. Like, that's really nice, John. But what's the scale? And so it's true that this is something where you can have sort of very clear metrics. And so actually at this point, we've sort of talked about it a little bit. It probably makes sense to have you just show us a little bit of what
Yeah.
you're describing. And so maybe I'll work on the technology. Maybe you could kind of set the stage for what you're about to show, kind of
Sure.
like what the
Okay.
person would be and what kind of situation, and I'll
Okay.
work on that.
So what I've got ready, as I mentioned at the beginning, we do quite a lot with professional sports teams. And the sort of circumstance here is, and for those of you who go to professional sports events in the States, quite often you'll get a fan experience survey after the game. And so what we've got here is an example of that. So what happens here is the fan experience survey is launched, people fill it in, and then after it's filled in, it all gets sucked straight into Relative Insight, and this is kind of like all the data. So we've got NPS surveys and CSAT surveys from purchases and things like this. So typically then a user would kind of like take the data and then think through what is it they really want to understand. And normally that is in a comparison. So let's say they want to understand, okay, the difference between promoters and detractors on the NPS of the fan experience. Let's go into that one. So what we've got here is the data. So what we've got are all the promoters, okay? Just under 22,000 words, 812 messages over a period of time. And then we've got everyone who is a detractor. So for people who aren't familiar with this is NPS. So it's basically promoters who are scoring you 9 or 10, and then detractors are people who are kind of scoring you, I think it's 0 to 6. So in other words, like people who are really happy compared with people who are unhappy. Now, what we're doing here is comparing these two because we really want to understand the promoters, what makes them happy. So what do they talk about significantly more than detractors? And so what we've got here are topics. So this is like high level topics, but we also do grammar, individual phrases, words, and emotion. And then what we're showing here are all kinds of different metrics. So the key one is sort of relative difference. So essentially this is telling you how much more the promoters are talking about this concept compared to detractors. It usually doesn't mean detractors don't talk about it. It just means that promoters are talking about it significantly more. So if we look at detractors then, this is what their detractors are talking about more than promoters. So they're talking about, bad, and they are talking about food, which is quite interesting. So you can click on a concept and you can start to see, okay, crackling, tasted, cherry, food. These are all like the relationships and what are contributing to that topic over index. And then we've got all the original data here, should you want to use that as well. So that's a good example. They also talk about travel. It says here like 10 times more. So clearly people having a bad experience are 10 times more likely to talk about having traffic or bad signage for parking or things like this. So now you're starting to understand not just, yes, people are detractors, but you're now starting to understand why. So we can then I won't go through all of these, but if you go into phrases, you can kind of start getting into a bit more details. So this is interesting here. These signs, this is the infinite sign. What this means is that detractors talk about, for example, long waits, but it never shows up at all in promoters. So this kind of just reinforces the thesis around parking and lines and things like this. So we do all kinds of different metrics. So we can do relative difference, but we can also do, percentage. So of the people who responded, of those respondents, of those questions, what percentage included food options, for instance, things like this. So you get the gist is that normally an analyst would like go through all of this data and then sort of compile a report with graphics and so on to distribute to stakeholders for action. But where analytics software is going is really moving from data. I always say it goes data, information, knowledge, and action. So what we're using AI to do is like really accelerate to knowledge very quickly. So this is the function of generative AI for us. We can click on the accelerator AI button,
And
and it will.
oh, sorry, Ben. I will look forward to this in just one moment. With the data, I was actually wondering, do you offer some sort of like regression, or I was anticipating, is there like the power of these are the things that are central, and maybe that's in the report, but I just want to ask.
Yes, no. So the report will pull all of that out. All of these things, we run a minimum 99% statistical confidence.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things are significant. There's another sort of hidden metric sort of behind that with relative difference, where actually the most important things we feel are at the top of the list. So,
Got it.
but you can see there's quite a lot of differences here.
Right.
So
Yeah, so please go ahead and tell us about the report, sort of how
yeah,
it feels a teeny bit overwhelming at first. So I can dive into everything. I love it because I'm a researcher, but I think as my
yeah.
stakeholder, right, that getting to action. So I'll let you take it from here.
Right. So I think this is the key thing. So for researchers, there are going to be certain reports that they're going to have to produce regularly. So for instance, they're going to need to do, I don't know, the car parking report for the people who run car parking. And what we can do with this is like by hitting one button on Accelerator AI, what this is doing is taking all of the stats which you've just seen with all of the original text, and it's compiling your report for you. So this is a generative AI generated report on promoters versus detractors. I won't go through all of it, but you can see that the metrics are embedded in it.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, it's saying detractors, overwhelmed staff, or amenities, chaotic, and so on. So this is, if you think about, it's quite a lot of effort to sort of, do the analytic, use any analytic tool, go through, highlight what's important, then put it out. This is now doing that for you. And this will maybe go to senior stakeholders. We've also introduced something called scoreboard, which allows different stakeholders, if you're in, say, concessions, you get the concession version emailed to you automatically right after the fan experience surveys come in on a Monday morning. But I think what we'll always see is this really evaporates a lot of the work for researchers who just do standard reporting all the time. But what you will see is stakeholders will say, actually, can you help me drill into this overwhelmed staff thing some more? Can you sort of tell me what's really behind that? And then you would kind of go back to the raw data and really start getting into the stats.
Hmm. Yeah, that when you started with really understanding the why, and right, we know there's a perception of overwhelm in this simple example, but not why they feel like those staff are overwhelmed or what is behind that. So interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, can I ask real quick? Do would this show me also like relative to the last game or each month or things like
Yeah.
that?
So time is incredibly important comparison axis. And so, what we'll have is very frequently we'll have data sets being put together here. This is just one example. So this is a specific one of how people are talking about departing the stadium. And yes, we can do direct. We can do, for example, the last game compared to the average of the other games. But what we find is this tends to be some things become so important that you need continual monitoring. And this is an example here. This is a product module called Heartbeat up here. And what we've got is the dotted line is the metric, satisfaction metric. And then below that, you can see the language themes which are causing that to move. So just before, for example, a drop in customer satisfaction, you can see parking is kind of peaking every time. And so what you can start to understand here is that this is one of the best high level examples of understanding why your metrics are moving, because we're showing the metric and we're showing you the language underneath that as well.
Yeah, no, really, really, I'm intrigued. Um, Maybe this is an easy one in terms of like there's a clear fan experience. For I imagine for actually, I wanted to ask you also. This feels anywhere where there's a customer experience. So certainly, I mean, imagine a hotel or a restaurant, or actually, I wanted to ask you about healthcare and if you do this kind of thing in that realm.
Yeah, so the patient experience, particularly in the US, is really important because it's a competitive market. Um, and what you tend to find are, let's say, any industry where there is a high emotional, financial, or time
Mm.
investment by the consumer, the higher the investment, the more you really need to understand what they say and what they think, as opposed to whether they give you a 7, an 8, or a 9, or a 10 on a checkbox. And patient experience is absolutely one of the big ones there. Um, so because there's so many things which maybe you wouldn't think are important really affect a patient experience. So for us, it's a big and growing application of our technology. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been asking a couple questions just because I'm really interested. But are there other things you wanted to show, or is this? I think I'm getting a good sense now. But
Yeah. No, I think people have probably seen enough of the
that's
tech.
fine.
I think what we have is quite an elegant concept of comparing things. But the fact that it drives metrics, and the fact that um, those comparisons can be across all these different metadata points really opens up massive amount of data. And I think what's interesting at the moment as well is um, I think senior stakeholders, one thing generative AI has done is that it's opened up their imagination around the value
Hmm.
of their open-end text data. You don't
Interesting.
actually need to
Yeah.
be able to, you don't need to persuade them anymore that there's gold here. But what they really need though are metrics. Like they don't want to see a summarization of a survey or heaven forbid another word cloud. No one wants to see another word cloud. But what they generally don't like are the subjective um, outputs like those. So we think the time is really ripe actually for like engaging with senior stakeholders on kind of why their businesses are actually running as they are because the data is normally there.
And I guess um, so I don't mean what you've got is really impressive. So I don't mean to, but I guess I can't help but think, gosh, there's so many sales calls, there's so many customer service calls, there's so many other data points that have text and that could be analyzed. And I just surely what you've got is of great value. I just wondered if that's an approach you've been considering or
Yeah, interesting. So we're being so most of what we do is kind of in that sort of voice of customer world. So, surveys, post transaction surveys, things like that. Market research surveys as well. Increasingly, though, we're being approached by some big vendors to help them out understanding call transcripts, chatbot transcripts as well, because obviously a lot of these are going to go to
mm,
conversational AI.
mm,
And again, conversational AI is great to do the conversation. It's not necessarily the right technology to do the metrics on
yeah.
the effectiveness of
Mm,
conversation. And what we, what the value we're bringing here is the kind of root cause analysis of not are your agents being empathetic or polite or knowledgeable about the
mm,
product, although obviously we can do that. The value we're bringing here is root cause analysis of why is that customer phoning you in the first place, and what can you do to understand why they're calling, understand what similarities they might have with other customer groups, and what actions can you take to improve the customer experience so that they don't have to call you at all.
sure.
So that's where most of our activity, and it's growing quite quickly actually. We're getting quite a lot of interest in the company. Yeah.
Excellent. No, I can see why. Well, taking a step back, we certainly talked a lot about your tools, and I guess I never really got a chance to ask you. It takes so much effort to create something like this and build the company that you've built. Just what inspired you to do this for this field? Like, what gave you that drive?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the origin story around the law enforcement was really the nub of it. Originally, this was a university R&D project, and when the company kind of got spun out of the university, that's when I got involved. And the original drive really was to solve that problem, which we did successfully do, and we helped in some convictions of some bad people, and some kids got protected through what we did. Um, but kind of commercial realities meant that actually that's not something you can do um, sort of sustainably as a software business. Um, so then it was all about, okay, we've proven that this is really cool technology, really great. So then the next sort of big adventure was like, okay, who else who can really benefit from this? And sort of market research was kind of the next obvious one. Like, because what we're really doing is like
Mm,
uncovering the differences between how people think, feel, what their emotions are, and so on and so on. So the technology was kind of the easy bit. Like learning a brand new industry like that was kind of
mm,
uh, was harder to some degree. Um, Especially when we started, I'd say text analytics really was, hey, here's a word cloud. That's all people were thinking about. Um, so yeah, it's been a
mm-hmm.
journey. Actually, there's a lot of people that really benefit, understand what we do, and are really using it in anger. There's some fantastic companies using relative insight, big brands that everyone will know in financial services or consumer subscriptions or. telcos and companies like this.
Do you, certainly they subscribe. I guess I was wondering. Uh, well, let me give you an example. So I've done a number of interviews with different groups of different teams, and one of the things that, for example, when I interviewed the group at wondering.com, they make it very easy to say, here are the questions I'm interested in having consumers answer. And it essentially launches a online like survey and interview and essentially gives you a summarized report. Okay, so that allows people who weren't researchers to sort of dive into things. It really spreads out who has this have an impact on them. And I guess I wondered how you're approaching that same problem of you've got real gold for people who really need to know it,
Yeah.
them wanting to not have someone like me in the middle and go straight to the data.
Well, yeah. So I think this whole area is going to really evolve pretty fast. I think in probably 2025, I think we'll start to see this. So I think there's a couple of principles that we have to bear in mind. So one is this, the request from someone in the customer says, I want to know what they think of this subject,
Mm-hmm.
which is a valid question. But normally you want to start with, I just want to know what they think, full stop. Because what they actually want to talk about might not be the thing that you want them to talk about. The thing that is really,
Mm-hmm.
grinding their gears about your product or service, you need to know about, but you've got to give them the chance to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think one of the reasons that people try and narrow the focus is the same reason why surveys are constructed as they are today. So, here's a question, 1 to 10. Here's another one, 1 to 10. Another one, 1 to 10. Here's an open end. Here's another open end, and so on. Surveys fundamentally are constructed like that because of the limitations of
Mm-hmm.
analyzing the surveys at scale from
Yeah.
decades ago, right? The reason it's
Yeah.
1 to 10 is that that's machine readable really easily. That's why it's like that. And the reason that a lot of people historically have shied away from putting open ends in is that they didn't want to pay people to read it or code it and do all that kind
Mm-hmm.
of old school stuff. And there's no reason to be formulating the surveys like that anymore. It's certainly not as a limitation of analyzing them at scale. And I think what's going to start happening is another function of Gen AI has been transcription tech at massive scale.
Mm-hmm.
So and we're starting to see this, you're starting to see a lot of restaurants putting in analytics around drive-through conversations,
Hmm.
gets transcribed to text so you can really understand what's making a great experience or not. Same thing's going to happen with surveys. Like, why would you fill in a survey if you can just drop off a voice note
Yeah.
and have it transcribed? And a couple of things will happen. Like, if you compare voice surveys with written surveys, you're talking about 2 orders of magnitude more text data. People talk 100 times more than they write. And people also talk in a different way to the way they tend to write.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking, you're more expressive. You tend to talk off the top of your head a bit more. You kind of maybe a bit more truthful than you are when you're doing a written response. And isn't that what we all really want to know from consumers? We want authenticity and we want truth. And there's no reason why we can't just get that now. But of course, it will mean we all have to kind of up our game on text analytics because that's the primary format, the data we're going to get.
Yeah. No, I was headed there too, and the fact that you can even with some of these tools direct the conversation. Certainly have an open end. Just tell me about your experience. But having these things at scale that can allow people to open up and have a question be presented to them about it makes it really interesting. So yeah, we're trying to. I do think that the way we approach research is really going to change. Is there anything actually, speaking back to the tools and things you've accomplished so far? Is there anything like an achievement or a milestone that you're particularly proud of? You've worked really hard at, and it's.
Yeah, well, I think, what I just showed you with Accelerator AI and then the subsequent products which are coming out, Scoreboard, which will be like automatically propagating other
Mm,
systems with that data. I'm very proud of that, not just because of, I hope people will have sort of seen the obvious benefits of
Mm,
it, but I'm proud of the whole company, I'd say, holding our nerve. So, a year ago or 18 months ago, when we were kind of at peak chat GPT hysteria, you had lots of people kind of going out, lots of vendors doing sort of bolt-on Gen AI, um, doing summarizations and saying that's text analytics.
mm,
Uh, or people thinking that, well, I've got a chat GPT license, I can do all this myself and so on. Um, and we didn't acquiesce to that pressure. Um,
mm.
we just, it would have been really easy just to say, yeah, fine, we'll just sort of, do a hallucination filled Gen AI summary of your text data. And we could have sold that, right? And we could have taken that to our customers, but we chose not to because we knew about the problem around hallucinations. We knew that metrics were critical. We knew that stakeholders don't take decisions without evidence and metrics. So I think I'm proudest then of like sticking to our guns and having Accelerator come out now, and like the wait list is really long for the product. I think it gives a really good blend of narrative with clear evidence, and the market's kind of coming towards us again. I think the market's gone through the sort of Gen AI hysteria, and now people are starting to understand what it's great at, what it wasn't designed for, and people are sort of appreciating that in what we're doing. So I think that's the thing I'm most proud of, actually, is holding on
Hmm.
nerve.
Very nice. And it is true that having those metrics can be so much more compelling to senior folks making decisions, rightly so. And yeah, just I actually did wonder if you ever work. So, since we often are working on the entire customer journey and building that and
Yeah.
identifying issues, if there are ways that your tools try to help to map that out as well.
Yeah, so customer journey has in the last 6 months become a really big thing, a really big thing for us because because a relative insight is the analytic layer. Like we're not the data gathering layer. So what that means is you can have data coming in from different survey tools, or from your chatbot or your customer experience or wherever it might be into relative insight. And you can put it all in and analyze it together. And you can understand the differences between people's different concerns and emotion in different parts of the customer journey, how it differs by different segments, and so on and so on. So customer journey mapping, orchestration, and analytics is becoming really big actually for us.
Hmm.
Again, that's another one the last 6 months is really taken me by surprise actually. So yeah, we're really excited by that one as well.
So where and I know I need to wind down, but where do you see this heading? So I mean, you've touched on it earlier, but I just wondered, as research teams and insights teams, how should they get ready for the future? Given you're building things, anticipating what's coming, what are you anticipating?
Yeah, so I think so first off, the capability is clearly already there for um, reports to be automatically generated and put out to stakeholders. Um, I think that the community that we serve, the analysts need to kind of they have a hand in dictating what those reports look like and what should be put out, and are they reliable? So understanding that, that's coming, like no matter what. Senior stakeholders are just want, people are just going to want, give me the report. Um, and I'll kind of ask you about the details later. I think that future is definitely coming. Um, but what the technology is also allowing analysts to do is really come up and dive into the unknown unknown type inferences, right? So the technology is there to really break the mold in terms of how you think about the data and how you can affect your stakeholders to think about the data as well. Um, because along with this like automatic reporting, with the metrics, it's a lot more credible now. So your ability to influence the whole organization, in my view, has just taken a big step change up because you've got the data and you've got the proof. And Gen AI just helps you like do help with the
Hmm.
story. So you've got this like much more powerful weapon now. So get ready to use it. I think don't shy away from it.
Nice. Uh, yeah, food for thought. And yeah, my mind is whirling on all the ways that I would love to have your tools ingest various things from our clients. Well, great. I think I have to stop at some point. It's such a pleasure speaking to you. If folks want to try your tool or understand more, how can they get started?
Yep. Well, you can just go to the website, which is relativeinsight.com. And there are various different blue buttons that you can click on, and we'll get you a free trial, and we'll kind of get some data loaded up so you can see what you would get out of it. Or if anyone wants to get in touch with me personally, my email is ben@relativeinsight.com.
Very nice. Okay, well, thank you so much, Ben. It's such a pleasure, and it's clear how thoughtful you are in your approach, and I also appreciate your focus to sort of the equivalent of scientific research for rigor for business. So being determined to hold steady with what you were doing. So it's a to be appreciated.
No, yeah, thanks for saying so. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And here, let me just sign us off. So again, thank you, Ben, for sharing relative insight with us. And so that's all for today. Just a very quick note, all these videos are not product endorsements. Brilliant always pays full price for all our technologies, and no one's getting paid. It's just to learn more together. So thank you so much for tuning in and keeping up with the latest AI for UX and insight research. Wishing you brilliant insights with AI.